Okay, welcome back, everyone. Dr. Linder. In this short PDF, I'd like to go over some of the key landmarks of the brain. All right, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at this top view. And now we're looking at a bird's eye view looking straight down on the skull. So this would be the left hemisphere of the brain, and this is the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, each hemisphere controls different function, right? The left cerebral hemisphere is more linear. It deals with your language, linear thinking, your logic, language. Your right side, your left side is also more science and math driven, whereas the right cerebral hemisphere of the brain is dealing primarily with things of like art and music and spatial relationships, like, oh, that picture will go good on that wall, or the couch looks better over there, or that tie goes good with that shirt, color coordinating. That's more right side of the brain. So the two hemispheres do work together, but certain sides of the brain have dominant function. We also know that the left side of the brain is going to control more movement on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls movement of the opposite limb. There's this crisscross that takes place somewhere at the level of the medulla oblongata, which is at the brainstem where the neurons cross. So we know that your right hand maybe is controlled by the left brain, and your left hand is controlled by the right brain. This is evidenced by people who have strokes. On the left side of their brain, they lose the ability to speak, but they also get hemiparesis or paralysis on the right side of the body. Okay, what else do we have? So we have these hills and valleys, if you would. I call them hills and valleys. So the hills are called gyrus, and the valleys, the depressions between, are called sulcus. Okay, gyrus and sulcus. Now, this is looking at, we call it the crystal skull. This is the left cerebral hemisphere, and again, the right cerebral hemisphere. Look at the spelling of the word. It's really important, cerebral, not to be confused with cerebellum, because you have the cerebrum and you have a cerebellum. They're two different parts of the brain, and you should not confuse them. So the left cerebral hemisphere, again, is more logic, more linear, more language-based, more science and math, whereas the right side is more artsy, more spatial awareness and facial recognition and music and art, that type of thing. Now, in the brain, as we have in the spinal cord, we have gray matter and white matter. The outer portion, which is called cerebral cortex, the word cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. That outer layer of a tree is called the cortex, or the bark. So this outer layer is called the cerebral cortex. It is gray matter, whereas the inner part is white matter, meaning this white matter is actually myelinated. The gray matter contains no myelin. Okay, so white matter, more internally based, and the cerebral cortex is gray matter. And again, we can see it on an actual brain, where we see the outer portion, which looks a little bit darker. That's the cerebral cortex, which is gray matter. And then the inner portion is white matter. This is the myelinated portion. And this is a cerebral hemisphere. This is another cerebral hemisphere. not to confuse cerebral with this part of the brain down here called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum and cerebrum are two different parts of the brain. They're structured different and they function different. Now, there is this separation or this long linear fissure that separates the left and right cerebral hemisphere, and that's called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure. It separates the left and right cerebral hemisphere from one another. Now, there is this part of the brain, the skull, that protects the brain. And let's take a look at some of the vessels that are important. You're going to see these again in AMP2 when we talk about the circulatory system and how blood gets to the brain, but also how blood drains from the brain and tries to drive that deoxygenated blood back to the heart so that the heart can pick up oxygen once again to drive the oxygen back to the brain. So there are some structures up here that will be important to identify. One of them is called the superior sagittal sinus. That's this blue arc on top. Now, if there's a superior sagittal sinus, there's going to be an inferior sagittal sinus. So it's almost like the double rainbow. The superior sagittal sinus is on top. It's that thicker arc. The inferior sagittal sinus is the smaller, thinner arc. And then there is a straight sinus and a transverse sinus. Then there is a membrane called a falx cerebri. Falx cerebri. Okay, now here's the longitudinal fissure that we showed you before. Then we have a transverse fissure. The transverse fissure is this linear separation between the occipital lobe back here, the green portion of the cerebrum is called the occipital lobe, and the cerebellum. This is the right hemisphere of the cerebellum and the left hemisphere of the cerebellum. So between the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, again, between the occipital lobe of the cerebrum and the cerebellum lies the transverse fissure. So here's the transverse fissure. Here's the longitudinal fissure. There is another membranous structure called the tentorium cerebelli, which is going to be found here where that transverse fissure is. Tentorium cerebelli. Now, here's the longitudinal fissure, which runs from anterior to posterior. Now, I also want you to look at the red structure here and this purple structure here. Now, this portion of the brain is called the frontal lobe. Okay, up in here is the frontal lobe. Here, more on the side, is the parietal lobe. So frontal lobe is more reddish. A little bit of the blue is part of the parietal lobe, even going back here. And way, way in the back where you can see a little bit of the green, that's the occipital lobe. Just different parts of the cerebral hemisphere. There's a frontal lobe, there's a parietal lobe, there's an occipital lobe, and way on the side is the temporal lobe near the ears. So between the red gyrus and this blue gyrus, this red gyrus is called the precentral gyrus, and this blue one is called the postcentral gyrus. So there's a precentral and a postcentral gyrus. I think it may even show it on the next page here. Okay, the red one from the side view is the precentral gyrus, and the blue is the postcentral gyrus. So here's the red and the blue. Again, this is a lateral view. This is the front of the brain, the frontal lobe. Here's the green. Here's the occipital lobe. This is the parietal lobe. This is frontal lobe. So you have a precentral and a postcentral gyrus. And what separates the two, what separates the precentral from the postcentral gyrus is a central sulcus. That's this depression right here, this central sulcus. So you have a longitudinal fissure and a central sulcus. The important feature of the central sulcus, you could see it from the lateral view, it separates the precentral from the postcentral gyrus. Now, the precentral gyrus, functionally speaking, is where all of your motor information starts. So if you want to move your arm or move your leg, that action that initiates that movement starts here in the precentral gyrus. All of the information that you feel within your limbs, within your upper limb and lower limb, ends up here in this postcentral gyrus. In the postcentral gyrus, this is where all of your sensory information ends up. This is what allows you to feel if someone touches your arm, or if you have an itch, if there's a bug that's crawling up on your leg, right? All that information ends up here at the postcentral gyrus. So again, postcentral gyrus, precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe. Here's the central sulcus from the lateral view. And then we have a lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is this lateral sulcus, this depression, and it's going to separate your parietal lobe from your temporal lobe. So this is the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. So we have your temporal lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, and the green back here, occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe deals with controlling your vision. Your temporal lobe is more hearing based. Your parietal lobe is your perception of your body parts in space and time. And your frontal lobe is really initiating your movements of your body, but it also controls your higher order thinking. Your personality comes from the frontal lobe. Your ambition, your drive, or lack of ambition, lack of drive, also comes from the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is a large portion of your personality, your ambition, your drive. Depression can come from this frontal lobe. Temporal lobe is more hearing. Parietal lobe is more perception. And your occipital lobe is your vision, right? Even though your eyes have receptors to see, it is the occipital lobe of the brain that actually does the seeing. So you can slip, fall on black ice, hit the back of your head on concrete and actually go blind, and nothing happens to your eyes themselves. But the vision center is back here. When we take the brain and we turn it upside down, it gives us a very, very different view. We could see a few cranial nerves. This one is called the olfactory nerve. So where it says olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, I'm okay if you put olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve for the sense of smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is called the optic nerve. You can see we have a right optic nerve and a left optic nerve. And where both of these nerves crisscross, right in the center, is a region called the optic chiasm. Chiasm means crisscross. It's where the two nerves cross. Right here is the pineal gland. And sometimes this, the pituitary gland, I think I said pineal gland, but this is the pituitary gland. Sometimes when the pituitary gland enlarges, it can put pressure on the optic nerves, creating visual disturbances. There could be problems with the eyes. Okay, really nice picture showing the different parts of the cerebrum, not cerebellum, but the parts of the cerebrum. Here's your frontal lobe, here's your parietal lobe, here's your occipital lobe, and there's your temporal lobe. What is it that's going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? This right here, the central sulcus. That central sulcus also separates the precentral gyrus, which is red, from the postcentral gyrus, which is blue. Motor information, sensory information. Motor, sensory. Okay, so nice picture. Again, clearly showing what I was describing before. Here's your frontal lobe that controls your drive, your ambition, your personality, your higher order thinking. It also is your inhibitory center, meaning if you think of a baby, when a baby is born, their heart rate is super, super fast. Their breathing, their respiration rate is super quick. And that's because the frontal lobe has not fully developed yet. So this is the part of the brain that inhibits or slows things down. When the frontal lobe develops, it slows down the heart rate. When the frontal lobe develops, it inhibits and slows down your respiration. But it also inhibits your personality. Like, little boy pushes his little sister down the stairs and the parent says, "Don't do that again. You can really hurt your brother or sister." Okay. The very next day, that 3-year-old or 4-year-old pushes their brother down the stairs again. "Didn't I tell you not to push your brother or sister down the stairs?" "Uh-huh. But then why did you do it?" "I don't know." Right? Now, I'm not teasing and making fun of, but through a little bit of humor, it helps you understand that little children don't have their inhibitory center. It's not fully developed. So that's why parents say, "Oh, that one's a daredevil. That one's, will try anything." There's no inhibitory center. People who have ADD or ADHD have issues in the frontal lobe where they can't inhibit. Think of a baby that wears a diaper. They can't inhibit the ability that they have to go to the bathroom until they're 4 years old, right? That's when they start to tell their mom and dad, and they get potty trained. They don't need a diaper anymore. It's because the frontal lobe can inhibit when they go to the bathroom. When children have enuresis, when they're 5 years old, 6 years old, and then they're still going to the bathroom or wetting the bed, it tells us that the frontal lobe still has not fully developed. Okay. Think of what happens when people get older. In the elderly, the frontal lobe starts to demise. It starts to break down. When it breaks down, that's when the adult goes back to wearing a diaper again, to wearing Depends, because they can't control when they go to the bathroom. So the frontal lobe is the inhibitory center. I see it a lot when people drive, road rage. Again, people who have a frontal lobe that controls them and they don't have control over it. So they'll follow someone for miles on the LIE just to give someone the finger, right? Just to tell them off or something. And it could be a complete innocent mistake, but the person that perceived it, their frontal lobe is really, really distorted. So then they do some sort of action and they're not thinking about long-term consequence. Why? Well, if I knock them off the road and create an accident, I didn't know there was a kid in the car, and then, innocent people end up dying, and that person that did the road rage goes to jail for quite a long time because they didn't have a healthy frontal lobe to properly think of long-term consequences. People that have healthy frontal lobes can actually think a few steps ahead. If I do this, what is the action? What's the consequence? Okay, so there's a little bit of background on the frontal lobe. When people would have mental illness, they would do a frontal lobe or frontal lobotomy, where they would actually remove a portion of the person's frontal lobe, or shock wave to shock the person's frontal lobe to try and create some sort of reset to their thinking. Okay, this is the precentral gyrus, also known as the primary motor area, but I would refer to it as the precentral gyrus. The area that's just next to it is the somatic motor association area. So these areas are going to talk to each other. Even though this is the primary motor strip, it will associate with an association area. So they do talk to each other. Now on the parietal lobe, here's the parietal lobe, here's the blue strip. That's the postcentral gyrus. This again is your primary sensory strip. The red is your primary motor strip. This is your primary sensory strip. And it too has a secondary or somatic sensory area where these areas talk to one another as well. On the posterior portion, we could see the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe has a visual cortex. This allows you to actually see. And then it sends a relay to the visual association area so that you can identify the object that you're looking at. So one allows you to see, that's the primary visual cortex, but then it relays that so you could say, oh, that is the brain, or that is the occipital lobe. You can interpret that information. Okay, here's the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe has a primary auditory cortex, so allows you to hear my voice. And then it will relay that to a secondary or an auditory association area so you can hear it and interpret the voice and go, oh, that sounds like Dr. Linder's voice, okay? Or you hear music on the radio and you can hear it, so we know that the auditory cortex is working, the primary area, but then it relays it. You can then interpret and say, oh, that's rap, or that's country, or that's classic rock, and then you can identify who the singer is. Okay, deep in the brain, if we separate the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe, we see this deeper orange area called the insula. Looks like a pit. Now, if we separate the left and right cerebral hemispheres, there's this band of white matter called a corpus callosum right here. And the corpus callosum is a band of white matter that connects the left and right cerebral cortex to one another. So although we separated the brain, the two hemispheres, you can't really separate it without slicing with a knife. Okay, this is all very connected at the corpus callosum. It's a band of white matter that connects one hemisphere to the other. The septum pellucidum is this clear membrane, the septum pellucidum, which separates your ventricles, your lateral ventricles, from one another. And I'll show you what the ventricles look like in a separate picture, but it's where cerebral spinal fluid flows, also known as CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. So this clear membrane is the septum pellucidum. Underneath that, an area called the fornix. This region down here is the medulla. This is the medulla. This is the pons. And right up here is the midbrain. So again, you have the medulla down here. This part is called a pons, which means bridge, pons. And going across right here is the midbrain. The midbrain. Again, three individual layers that you should be able to identify. The corpus callosum. Women have a much stronger corpus callosum and a thicker corpus callosum than men do. And this helps for the left and right hemispheres of the brain to communicate better with one another. Here's the septum pellucidum. And underneath you could see again, it says lateral ventricle, because you have a lateral ventricle in your right hemisphere, and you have another lateral ventricle in the other hemisphere, in the left hemisphere. And then here's the fornix. Down here is the medulla. This is the pons. And then going across this way is the midbrain. The midbrain. Back here is the cerebellum. It looks like a leaf right back here. That's called the cerebellum. That's for your balance and coordination. Important area, septum pellucidum. This depression is really important because it's the cavity or the depression for the lateral ventricle. One lateral ventricle will sit here, and the other lateral ventricle will sit here in this depression. Here is the olfactory nerve. Again, this is your sense of smell, cranial nerve number 1. Your cranial nerves are named in order that they develop. So cranial nerve 1 develops first for sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2, optic nerve, vision would be the second one that develops. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor. So the order that you learn them is the order in which embryologically they develop. Okay, so here is the corpus callosum. Here's the septum pellucidum. This was the fornix, right? So we did those 3 already. Here's the thalamus. The thalamus is the relay station for all of your sensory input. Every bit of sensory input that comes into your nervous system will find a way to synapse right there at the thalamus. All of your sensory input, except the sense of smell. The sense of smell bypasses the thalamus. Okay, the little yolk, that little yellow yolk right there in the center is just called the interthalamic adhesion, an interthalamic adhesion. So the round main circle right here is the thalamus. Below the thalamus, so here's the thalamus, below is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, this part of the brain here, controls the ANS. It controls the autonomic neural system, the ANS. What is the ANS, the autonomic neural system? The hypothalamus controls the parasympathetic and sympathetic. That's the ANS, the autonomic neural system. It's made up of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic neural system. So here's the hypothalamus. It controls the ANS, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, when we zoom in on the brain, let's go out just a little bit right there. Here's the thalamus, just to review. Here's the thalamus. That's the interthalamic adhesion. Here it looks a little brown. Below the thalamus, here's the hypothalamus, this arrow. This is the hypothalamus. Here's the pituitary gland. And the stalk that connects to it is called the infundibulum. The infundibulum is the connection that goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And the hypothalamus sends signals to the pituitary. And in AMP2, when you cover endocrinology, you're going to learn about the connections between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the pituitary gland has an anterior pituitary and it has a posterior pituitary. And each division is responsible for releasing different types of endocrine hormones. The pituitary gland sits in this depression, which should sound a little bit familiar, an area called the sella turcica. Here's the corpus callosum. Here's the septum pellucidum. Here's the fornix. Here's the thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, hypothalamus. Now this vascular structure right here is called a choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is significant. It is responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid, known as CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Pineal gland is back here, not to be confused with the pituitary. So the pineal gland is back here. Here is the medulla. Here's the pons. And this section right here is the midbrain. Okay, so here's the corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, the yolk, which is the interthalamic adhesion, thalamus, hypothalamus. Here's the choroid plexus, which is responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid, known as CSF. And the choroid plexus is lined with a different type of neuroglial cell called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells line the choroid plexus, and it's those ependymal cells that really are responsible for producing CSF, known as cerebral spinal fluid. Back here is the pineal gland. Okay, we're looking at the sagittal view. Here's the medulla. Here's the pons. And here's the midbrain. There are these two bumps back here on the posterior midbrain. See if we could show it to you a little bit close-up view. Here's the midbrain. So these two bumps, the ones on the top are called superior colliculi, and the ones on the bottom are called the inferior colliculi. The superior and inferior colliculi are part of the midbrain. And they're part of the, see if I can turn it around. So if we take the midbrain, pons, and medulla, but we don't separate it, this is what it looks like from the posterior view. Here's the medulla, here's the pons, and this section here is the midbrain, where we can see the superior colliculus and the two inferior colliculus. What we were looking at in the picture above was if we separate this right down the center, then it takes us to the sagittal view, where you're looking at one superior colliculi and the other inferior colliculi, but there's 4 of them, right? There's 2 on each side. So when you have 1, 2 superior colliculi and 1, 2 inferior colliculi, those 4 are called corpora quadrigemina. It means the body of 4, corpora quadrigemina. The superior colliculi are involved in moving your eyes and helping your eyes track, like when you're reading. And the inferior colliculi is involved in, let's say, turning your head if you hear a loud bang or a loud noise from the corner of the room and your head turns. So the inferior colliculi involves the auditory reflex, whereas the superior colliculi is involved with the visual reflex, like your eyes tracking paper as you're reading. Okay, medulla, pons, and once again, this section is the midbrain. The midbrain contains the corpora quadrigemina with the 2 superior colliculi and the 2 inferior colliculi. Okay, right here in the medulla is a section called the medullary pyramids. The pyramids are a section in which, if you remember one of the first few slides, I was talking about how the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Right here at the level of the medullary pyramids, the information crosses from the brain down into the medulla. Okay, it's at this level of the pyramids. They call it the decussation, where they crisscross. Here's the cerebellum. Notice the difference in the spelling, cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in controlling your balance and your coordination. So if there's a sobriety checkpoint and a police officer asks you to step out of the car, to walk heel to toe, they're making sure that you're not under the influence of any chemical or alcohol or drugs, because they can get into the cerebellum affecting your balance. So they ask you to walk heel to toe. Or they'll say, touch your finger to the tip of your nose for that type of precision and coordination. Now, there are many neurological diseases in which people can't do that. So not everyone that's pulled over is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Some people really do have neurological condition, and that needs to obviously be explained to a police officer if that's the case. Okay, so here's the right cerebellar hemisphere. Here's the left cerebellar hemisphere. And what connects the two is the central region called the vermis. Vermis means like worm, worm in German. When we separate the 2 cerebellar hemispheres, not cerebral hemispheres, you have to know the difference between cerebral hemisphere and cerebellar hemisphere. So here's the cerebellar hemisphere separated. You could see the white matter, which are like the veins of the leaf. That's called the arbor vitae. And then the gray matter is called the cerebellar cortex. In the brain, in the cerebrum, it was called cerebral cortex. In the cerebellum, it's called cerebellar cortex. It's still the outer portion, which again is gray matter. The arbor vitae, which look like the veins of the leaf, that is white matter. Okay, now we're getting into the ventricles. Let me see if I can scroll back to that. There it is. So here, when we look underneath the brain, is this depression or this cavity for the lateral ventricles here and here. So what's going to sit there are the gray ventricles. Let's go back to it right here. So there's 4 ventricles. This is lateral ventricle 1 and lateral ventricle 2. So each of these would sit into the cavity. When we rotate it, here's again one of the ventricles, and here's the other. These are called lateral ventricles because they're in the lateral parts of the brain. What we have circulating through here is cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. In order for the CSF to go from the lateral ventricles, 1 and 2, and to get into the third ventricle, which is here, it has to escape through the interventricular foramen of Monro. The interventricular foramen of Monro, which is here. After it escapes through the interventricular foramen of Monro, it can then find its way into the third ventricle. Then CSF drains down from the third ventricle into the cerebral aqueduct. And from the cerebral aqueduct, it finds its way into the fourth ventricle. So there's 4 ventricles, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In order for the CSF to go from lateral ventricles into the third ventricle, it's got to go through the interventricular foramen of Monro. And to go from the third into the fourth ventricle, it has to go through the cerebral aqueduct. Sometimes the cerebral aqueduct is referred to as the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvia. After it's in the fourth ventricle, the CSF has a few escapes. It can go out through these lateral apertures or down the median aperture. And if it gets into the median aperture, it's going to go right down the center of the spinal cord, where the central canal is of the spinal cord.